I'm Adrienne Eaton, the Dean of the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University, the State University of New Jersey, which is the host of the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. And again, because Joe Blasi couldn't be here, I am channeling Joseph a bit today. So as we're settling in, I hope that you all had productive conversations over lunch, whether they were formally in breakout groups or your own structured breakout group. I'm just going to say a few things and then turn things over to Adria to run our next panel. So one thing is, again, to thank the Aspen and Rutgers teams, and I won't name everybody again, but you've seen them running around and doing all the things that they need to do, and it's just, I think we would all agree, very well organized, except maybe the internet yesterday, which is all the U.S. Capitol's fault, not Aspen or Rutgers' fault, if we want to assign blame. Last year, if some of you may remember, I did some kind of summary of what the themes were and learning. I'd taken extensive notes over 2 days. I am not going to do that again, and I haven't taken those kind of notes. But I do want to just say a couple things that I've heard over the last day and a half so far, and we may hear more along these lines or new things. One, I think a thing that we haven't really talked about in this community before is the idea of employee-owned companies merging with, taking over, buying other employee-owned companies, or helping to drive employee ownership in companies they may acquire. I think this is very interesting. I don't think there's much research on that, and that's something that perhaps we'll need to focus on or have a whole panel on next time around. A second thing that I've really enjoyed hearing about and thinking about more, and was glad to see that we have a fact sheet from the Institute about employee ownership in rural America. And just say I spent a vacation last May driving around Kansas, Oklahoma, and eastern Colorado. Don't ask me why. I can explain. I was hitting my 50 states, which I did successfully, but it was quite devastating to see the lack of economic activity in small town after small town, and to kind of understand, the political concerns coming out of those kinds of places. And so I think this attention to small town and rural America is really important. I want to say just one other thing, which is a little bit of a self-criticism, but increasingly, those of you who are academics may be aware of this. Our federal funders, our universities are thinking more and more about the role of the studied in studies. And one of the things coming out, we were talking about this over lunch, about from the disabilities movement, originally nothing about us without us. And we're starting to think about what that means for the research enterprise. So again, for disabled workers, we shouldn't be doing research on disability without including disabled workers in consultation. There's a faculty member at Rutgers who does work on addiction, and the addiction community should be part of structuring research. And we're really hoping to move forward with some of these ideas at the School of Management and Labor Relations. But it really strikes me, and I know some of others have said this to me over the last day and a half too, that it would be great to have some actual worker voices in these conversations that we're having. And our unions and co-ops program, which is part of the Institute, has been part of the Institute, did that successfully one time. It's not a trivial chore to figure out how to make that work. I recognize that completely, but I think it would be a wonderful goal to try and figure out how to bring worker owners to these conversations and hear from them directly. So with that, I will stop and turn things over to my dear colleague, Adria Scharf again.
Thank you so much, Dean Eaton. I really appreciate those synthetic comments, and especially that last point about the importance of including worker voices. I'm Adria Scharf. I'm an associate director at the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing, which many of you know is housed within the Rutgers University School of Management and Labor Relations. And I'm very delighted to be here with you this afternoon to moderate this, what will be a really interesting discussion with an exceptional panel focused on the future of equity compensation. And I am stepping in here to substitute for my colleague, Joseph Blasi, who has been a colleague, friend, and mentor to many in this room, and who, as some of you know, had to go to Pennsylvania for a very serious family medical emergency. So I know all of us who know Joseph are sending our good wishes to him today. And Joseph really put some thought into crafting this discussion. I know he, is the founder of our institute, and he really sees equity compensation as central to the larger conversation about employee ownership, the larger kind of employee ownership movement. And so I'm honored to attempt to step into his shoes. He did share some notes with me, so I will try to represent his vision as best I can, and I'm sure I'll add some of my own stamp to it too. But first, I want to start by welcoming our panel of experts, and I'll just very briefly introduce bios. As you know, are on the website and in the app. But starting at the end of the table, we have Anthony Cimino, who's Vice President and Head of Policy at Carta. We have Barbara Baksa, who is Executive Director of the National Association of Stock Plan Professionals. Annalisa Miller is founding Executive Director of Ownership Works. And Bob Patricelli is Senior Advisor of InTandem Capital Partners. So welcome one and all, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. I think before I share Joseph's comments, I just want to kind of acknowledge a little linguistic shift in terms of language. We've been talking kind of for the last day and a half about employee ownership. Now we're going to kind of shift and use this language of equity compensation, and this might be really clear to everyone in this room, but just sort of for the sake of inclusion, knowing people are streaming in too, just to say kind of explicitly, by equity compensation, we basically mean stock-based compensation. And the idea of equity compensation and the idea of employee ownership obviously are very closely tied, because a share of stock is a unit of ownership in a company. So if you're paying someone in terms of equity or in terms of shares of stock, you're in fact, in a sense, sharing some portion of ownership with employees. What you may not be sharing the whole bucket of ownership rights with those employees. And the sort of bucket of equity compensation includes lots of specific vehicles, from stock grants, including RSUs or restricted stock units. Many of us have heard of stock options. Employee stock purchase plans are a very common form of equity compensation in publicly traded companies, and I think we'll touch on probably many of those here today. So I just wanted to kind of define some terms. So what Joseph wanted me to share here in framing, he wanted to welcome our esteemed panel. He said he really wanted to make two main quick points in framing. First, he wanted to say that in his view, employee share ownership in the United States is a coin with two sides. There's the ESOP side, which we've talked a lot about so far, and then there's this equity compensation side. And this panel is about the non-ESOP equity compensation side of that employee share ownership coin. ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, have about 11 million active employees with 4 million retired participants still receiving benefits, or about 15 million employees involved. ESOPs are the largest broad-based equity ownership phenomenon in the United States and in American history to date. And as many know, the ESOP is like employee ownership in the form of a retirement plan. And it has some particular features, including the fact that it's statutorily inclusive. So if you're a company that adopts an ESOP, you don't have the discretion just to offer stock to some of your employees. You have to kind of follow the federal pension rules and include all or most of your workers. There's some asterisks and specificity there, but in general, ESOPs are by law inclusive. And then the other half of the sort of the employee share ownership coin, equity compensation, covers, Joseph estimates, about 11 million employees, although we don't have 100% definitive estimates of that number. And Joseph emphasized that unlike ESOPs, these plans are not broad-based, or are not for the most part broad-based. There are some exceptions. And then the second point, Joseph wants to announce that the Rutgers Institute last year set up the Shares Laboratory, which is kind of the first laboratory of its type. And Doug Cruz is here, who's been closely involved. Others here have been closely involved, but it's producing regular quarterly reports using nationally representative data, looking at patterns of equity ownership nationwide among American workers, and looking specifically at disparities. So a couple of our recent reports have focused in very carefully on the really unconscionable and extreme racial disparities in equity ownership, and the gender disparities as well. Okay. Joseph closed with, Employee share ownership in the U.S. nationally will not go anywhere unless the equity compensation side of the coin is seriously expanded. And we have asked the members of this panel to have a wide-ranging discussion on how we might do that. Okay, with that, thank you. With that, I'd love to invite you all maybe just to introduce yourselves, share a bit about your work, and we touched on the issue of disparities or kind of gaps and inequities in terms of equity ownership. So if you could introduce yourself and your work and then sort of speak a little bit to those, like in what way does your work touch on that issue? I don't know, Anthony, if you'd like to start.
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks so much for having me on the Aspen Institute in Rutgers, obviously. My name is Anthony Cimino. I lead the public policy team at Carta, an equity management platform that is built around creating more owners. That largely started through cap table administration in the venture space, but has grown to not only more traditional businesses, but also the firms, whether those are venture-backed or PE-backed firms that invest in them, all for the goal of expanding ownership in that space. So just to touch on a couple of the points, I think, and folks in this room are very familiar, we're at a key moment in the ownership economy discussion, and I hope when we look back, it'll be an inflection point. And the reason why I think it's a key moment is, one, even in the venture space where employee ownership is actually standard, over 2022 to 2023, we actually saw the proportion of equity an average employee would get in that company decline by about 35%. Now, that decline could reflect anything from equity declines, and as a result, people were indexing less for it during this kind of general contraction. But we've seen a decline, and that has some negative outcomes. But I think the other big thing is what you just pointed out. In 2018, Carta started studying the equity gap. And so when everybody was focused on salary, we have cap table data for around 42,000 companies. And we realized the disparity between, at the time, gender. Women were getting 47 cents on the dollar in equity compared to men. Each year after, we've built out and iterated to include race and ethnicity, geography, parents versus non-parents. And unfortunately, we've not seen these trends really reverse themselves. But as negative as that all sounds, why I think that this still can be an inflection point rather than a retrenchment is because increasingly we're seeing more people interested in talking about employee ownership, and not just through the ESOP plans, but through these wide-ranging different vehicles. And although some of that has gone back a little bit, we're now seeing more, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk about this, more investors interested in this, more traditional businesses get interested in this, and seeing the virtue, but also the value in employee ownership. And I think if we can continue to build on this momentum, we can turn it into a flywheel, and hopefully we'll look back and see this as the opportunity to do that.
Thank you so much. Barb?
Thanks. I'm Barb Baksa. I'm the executive director for the National Association of Stock Plan Professionals. So if you think about the companies that you've maybe heard of in the news that offer stock options or restricted stock units or an employee stock purchase plan to their employees, someone at that company, usually a team of people at that company, has to oversee how those plans work. And that team would be a member of my organization. And we're there to provide support to those individuals that are overseeing those equity compensation plans. So we offer a number of resources around equity compensation. We have chapters across the country. We have an annual conference. We offer a lot of education. We also conduct surveys of our members around the types of equity compensation that they are offering, who they're offering that compensation to at their employees. And I'm going to talk about some of those survey results in a little bit, hopefully. And I also, one thing I want to share, I'm a true believer in equity compensation. I really, in terms of the coin that you talked about, I'm squarely on the equity compensation side. I know barely anything about the other side. But I really believe that equity compensation can be life-changing for the employees that receive it. And I believe that because it was life-changing for me. In 1994, I moved to California. I was just really fresh out of college. I come from a very working-class background. And in getting to California, I moved from Chicago, just getting to California, getting settled out there, it took all my money. I was down to nothing in my savings account. And but luckily, I scored this job at this little startup. And this startup granted me some stock appreciation rights or some stock options. And then that startup got acquired by a publicly held company. And that publicly held company had an employee stock purchase plan. And it granted me some more equity awards. And so in the 6 years from when I moved to California and I had nothing to 2000, I had a down payment on a house. And I had it because of my equity compensation. And that purchase, like having a house, that changed everything for me. It allowed me to reach a level of financial stability that it would have taken me a lot longer to reach. And unfortunately, I think the current environment for equity compensation has shifted. And when I talk later about my data, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've seen it shifted. But my story, if you move that story forward 10 years, I'm not in the same boat today. Things have changed. So I'm going to talk about that when I get to my data. But I really think that if we can sort of reverse that trend that we're seeing and encourage more companies to grant equity more broadly, we can make a big difference in the lives of employees.
Thank you so much. We'll definitely come back to your data in just a minute. Annalisa.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and thank you for sharing that story. It's very energizing and inspiring, and I think why we're all here. I'm Annalisa Miller. I'm the Executive Director of Ownership Works. We're a nonprofit organization that was founded about 2.5 years ago, and we work with investors and companies to implement broad-based employee ownership programs, which fall in the coin of equity-based compensation. So these programs are grants of stock appreciation rights, restricted stock units. They are granted at no cost to the employees that participate, and they are broad-based. So the companies that we work with make a commitment to include all employees at the company that we work with access to these types of equity-based compensation. We work with private equity firms. We have 30 private equity partners that have joined us and made commitments to implement in their portfolio companies, but we're also starting to work with public companies and family-owned businesses as well. We're not a business succession strategy. These are companies that are not looking to exit, but these employee ownership plans are funded by the current owners or investors in the company itself. I think, on the data that you shared around racial disparities in wealth and stock ownership. So one of the things I often share, and folks in the room might know this, but corporate equities is the single largest driver of this. The disparity in ownership of corporate equities is the single largest driver of the wealth gap. And so the value of corporate equities has exploded since 1989, but the vast majority of that wealth has been captured by the top 10% of households. And so the bottom 50% of all households has maintained pretty much a consistent share of ownership of corporate equities around just about 1%, and that gets more exacerbated around racial lines. And one of the things that is just staggering to me is that you can look in the last few decades and see fluctuations in the black-white wealth gap, but it still today remains larger than it was in 1983. So we have a long way to go in making a difference here and getting people access to stock ownership at work, I think, is a really meaningful way to help address this gap, particularly as the other pathways to ownership are getting harder and harder, right? It's getting harder to own a house, which has been, for many ways, the way working folks have been able to have some ownership and build some wealth and security. On employee ownership and the potential to reach Black and Latino workers in particular, I think, the current owners and investors are the gatekeepers, right? They have to decide to want to share ownership. And this work tends to resonate with mission-minded CEOs and investors, right? They get this idea of, oh, wait, yes, typically they'll have some form of equity-based compensation. It's usually senior management. You share this idea of include everyone. And there's mission-minded CEOs and investors that are like, oh, that makes a ton of sense. Let's do it. But there's a whole universe of investors and CEOs that they're like, oh, okay, and there's, I think there's other ways that we can think about financial security or other opportunities. And what we're really focused on is making the business case around equity-based compensation and how it can benefit companies so that we can get more beyond the mission-minded CEOs and investors to the folks who are really thinking about I just need to make this business stronger and profitable. And how can employee ownership help me do that? I think that's really critical to reaching workers of color through this strategy. The more mainstream it becomes, the more people understand this is a way to create a stronger, better business, the more we're going to be able to influence more of those current owners and investors and reach more diverse workforces over time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your clarity about the importance of the broad-based quality of these plans, which is not kind of the pervasive model in the equity compensation conversation. Just to be clear about the importance of broad-based equity is very important. Bob Patricelli, just a quick introduction and share your initial thoughts about these issues of disparity.
Well, we were asked to introduce ourselves, and I guess I'd start by saying I'm on my third career. I had 11 years right out of law school in the federal government. I was Senate staff counsel. I was in policy-making positions in the Nixon and Ford administration. And then I went back home to Hartford, Connecticut, and went into business and spent 40 years learning business, and then ultimately starting 3 companies from scratch. All were national companies. One became a New York Stock Exchange company, was very successful. All 3 were PE funded. And in the last 2, we gave equity to every employee in the company. So I'm a practitioner. I believe in it. In my third career, I am involved with a particular private equity company, but I'm trying to bring the threads of my background together into some policy advocacy. And if there's one thing I would say to this group is it needs to have a legislative strategy. If you want to do something big, you need legislation. And I hope to be able to describe to you today the plan that was first introduced in 2021 and now in a revised form will be introduced shortly. It deals with the wealth gap, and I was so pleased to hear Annalisa refer to that. I'm not here to tout employee ownership as an end in itself. I'm here to tout it as a means, the best means, of dealing with wealth redistribution. And I'll talk about that when I have a chance.
Absolutely. We look forward to that. Thank you, Bob. Barb, you mentioned your data findings, so I'd like to just circle back to you and ask you to kind of share what you found.
Sure, I would love to do that. All right, so this is a survey that we conduct with Deloitte, and it is a survey of all publicly held companies. We've been conducting this survey since like 1993, and what I'm going to share are the results from our most recent survey, which was done in 2021. This particular survey is done on a 3-year cycle, so we're actually in the process of updating this data right now. If there are any companies that grant equity compensation in the room, talk to me. I'd love to get you into the survey. So we had about, in 2021, we had just under 400 respondents to the survey. They're all publicly held companies. They represent all industries, all sizes of public company. They're almost all U.S.-based companies, but all regions within the U.S. And 35% were in the high-tech, biotech, or life sciences space. The rest were in other industries, non-tech industries. And the survey looks at the types of equity awards companies offer and who they offer those equity awards to at their companies. And then we also look at the specific terms and conditions, which is not something we're particularly interested in today. I'm going to focus just on the types of equity awards companies offer and who they offer them to. And in the survey, we define 3 main types of equity. There's what we call appreciation-only vehicles, which are mainly stock options. And if you at all follow equity in the news, you've probably heard that phrase, stock options. A stock option is the right to buy stock at a set price over a set period of time. And hopefully, usually the price is equal to the value of the stock when the option is granted. Hopefully the stock grows in value, and then eventually the employee is able to buy the stock and sell it and make a bunch of money. And before 2004, stock options were the primary way the companies delivered equity to their employees. Now what we see, the other type of equity that we see are full value awards. Full value awards are different than stock options in the sense that the employee doesn't have to buy the stock. With a full value option, with a full value award, the employee just gets the stock for free. It's a nice deal. And then the third type of equity that we see is an employee stock purchase plan. The first two, stock options and full value awards, are what I call a discretionary equity vehicle, which means that the company decides who they're going to grant those vehicles to and how large of a grant the employees are going to get. With an employee stock purchase plan, that is a broad-based vehicle. If the company wants to offer an ESPP, it will typically be a tax-qualified plan, and to be tax-qualified, they have to offer the ESPP to substantially all of their employees. The employees have to sign up to participate. They usually have to contribute to the plan through payroll, and then their payroll contributions are used to buy stock, usually at a discount, sometimes at a very substantial discount. So those are really the three types of equity that we look at in the program or in the survey. So what we see overall, just looking at companies that offer any type of equity, any of those three types, maybe all three, maybe just one, but any of those three types, what we see is that for the public companies in the survey, 93% are offering some type of equity to their middle managers. 73% are offering some type of equity to their junior managers, and 58% are offering some type of equity to their general workforce, which we categorize as non-exempt employees. In terms of for middle managers and junior managers, the equity that's offered is often in the form of full value awards, typically restricted stock units. For the general workforce, the equity that's offered is often in the form of an employee stock purchase plan. At the general workforce level, only 25% of respondents to the survey are offering discretionary equity vehicles, so either stock options or full value awards. So for the general workforce, the way that those employees are most likely to receive equity is through an employee stock purchase plan. And that doesn't, those statistics, those don't sound too bad. Like 58% of companies are offering equity to their general workforce. But now what I want to do is take a step back about 20 years to the year 2000 and look at the survey data that we had back then. So in the year 2000, first of all, 100% of the respondents to the survey granted stock options. Only 20% were granting full value awards. It was usually in the form of restricted stock because RSUs actually weren't even a thing in 2000. So the majority of companies were granting stock options. 44% of respondents to the survey said that they granted stock options to all of their U.S. employees. If I look at the high-tech sector, in 2000, 74% of high-tech companies were granting stock options to all of their U.S. employees. If I look at the current data, only 43% of high-tech companies are granting equity at the general workforce level. And you'll notice that there's a difference in my terminology. So in 2000, I said they were granting to all of their employees. In the current survey, we've changed sort of how we ask the question. So what it means in the current survey is they're granting to some of their general workforce, but possibly not all of their employees. So we've seen, fewer companies are granting at the general workforce level than in 2000, and they may not be granting to all of them. Also, if we look at ESPPs, currently about half of companies have an ESPP, just under half, it's 49%. Back in 2000, 62% of companies were offering an ESPP. So we've seen a pretty significant shift. And you might think that shift happened pretty gradually, but it didn't. It happened actually really quickly around 2005. Anybody here know why that shift happened? No one? .com bust? No. An accounting standard. In 2005, actually it's the end of 2004, right before Christmas, because that's when the FASB issues major accounting standards that might sort of interfere with someone's time with their family over the holidays, the FASB issued a new accounting standard for stock compensation. Prior to that accounting standard coming out, stock options were free. Companies could grant stock options, and they did not recognize an expense in their income statement for the options. They were completely free. Not only that, they were non-cash. They're still non-cash. and the company got a tax deduction. So that's kind of the trifecta of compensation. No hit to the P&L, we get a tax deduction, and on top of that, we're not paying out cash to our employees. That is a great deal. You can't beat that deal. And in 2004, FASB said, you know what, we don't think we're accounting for stock compensation correctly. We think that there should actually be an expense. There is a cost to the company for these equity awards, and they need to, we really need that cost to be reflected in the P&L.
Barb, thank you. Thank you. It was really, and we're going to circle back and talk more about rule changes and policy suggestions.
Okay.
So you can,
Sorry, I'm
but
taking
thank you
too much
so
time.
much.
Sorry.
That was wonderful. And I have one clarification question I'm going to ask you two later. Annalisa, let's jump to you and kind of the private equity space, thinking about challenges. What are some of the challenges or barriers to expanding broad-based equity compensation kind of through private equity vehicles?
Sure. I think a lot of the challenges will be familiar to a lot of the folks in the room that are trying to work with any current owner on employee ownership. And so there's a lack of general awareness around the model. And then when people are aware of the model, there's a perception that it's just going to be too complex and too hard to do. So that the structuring of the plan is going to create tax and accounting and legal and administrative burdens that are too much of a lift for the company. And then there's a perception that maybe employees won't understand the program and so they won't value the program. And so when we initially start talking to private equity investors and portfolio company management teams as well, and public company leaders and family-owned businesses, there's really a common set of reservations that we've encountered, and those are what we've come across. And so what we've tried to do is create on the structuring of the plan an approach that minimizes the administrative complexity so that investors and companies we can get them to yes quickly. And so that's helped a great deal. On the piece about will employees understand the program and will they value the program, we put a tremendous amount of time and effort into what a lot of folks in the room will be familiar with is talking to companies about how do you build a culture of ownership where employees feel, think, and act like owners. And to do that, you have to take time to explain to employees what is this ownership program? What is this instrument that you've received? How do companies increase in value over time? What are the levers that impact that? How do you define that? So it takes work. It takes time and effort. Fortunately, the field has research. There's case studies. There's case studies that our founder and some of the partners that we work with have. And so when we can tell a firm or a management team, we can reduce the administrative complexity. We can help you explain the program to employees. We can help you with building a culture of ownership. They start to get over some of those initial sort of like, this is going to be way too hard and it's not going to work. And they open up a little bit and they say, let's give this a shot.
Anthony, thinking about challenges, Carta tracks equity for a lot of different tech and non-tech companies. Share a little bit about what you see are some of the barriers to companies adopting equity plans and kind of pushing those equity plans down to the lower echelons in terms of wage earners, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think I'll probably focus in on some of the things that have already been said. And Lisa, you said focusing on the gatekeepers and really thinking through beyond mission-driven enterprises. And we think about it in a similar context, and we try and talk about it. This isn't about virtue, it's about value. And this is how businesses outperform. This is how you attract and retain the best talent, how you align the workforce not only on short-term but long-term goals, and ultimately how you win in the marketplace. And this goes to that awareness point. In many cases, this is not a structure that traditional companies were thinking through when they were incorporating and building. And so, one, how do you make them aware that this isn't just about virtue, but this actually delivers to their bottom line? And doing so in a way that, as was just mentioned, releases some of those friction points. And so we create blueprints around different structures. We've created different opportunities where in an LLC model, for instance, you might not be able to convert to a pure stock grant so much as a profit interest unit or a phantom equity. How do you make that real for everybody? How do you make it easy to track for the performance of the firm and its investors, but increasingly for those employees to make sure that they understand what value they're getting out of it? And I think that the other factor we've got to really start thinking through is how do we talk about making ownership meaningful? And it works perfectly for Barb in your story, and in many cases for a lot of the venture-backed tech companies where growth might be very substantial, and at some point the company gets bought or IPOs and there's an opportunity to liquidate those shares. In some cases, the private equity model might not be analogous, but is similar insofar as you might expect a more rapid growth and an opportunity for transaction to allow that equity to then be turned into realizable cash. In many cases, we're not just looking to do this through venture-backed channels or PE-backed channels, but just through traditional businesses. And how do we help them understand the importance of the conversion and then provide that value and do so in a way that's really helping them understand what liquidity might look like, what value growth might look like, and how they communicate that to their workforce so that everybody's aligned as to how to contribute and what that timeline might look like. And so those are the things that, candidly, we're still trying to tackle and do so in predictable, repeatable ways to make equity not just something that sits on paper, but meaningful for your life and predictability around when that can happen.
Could I add something to that? As we start to work with family-owned businesses and public companies, we're bumping up against the same thing: is how do you create liquidity for employees along the way, especially the employees who are most in need. And so the private equity context, you have this 4 to 7 year hold period. There's this sort of, payout that's expected, but where you don't have that, how do you recreate that? So we're actually starting to work with a long hold, with a holding company that acquires operating companies. And we're thinking, how can we manufacture liquidity events every 5 years so that, and have the opportunity for employees to either sort of receive cash or reinvest. And so they have an option to build up towards retirement or meet their short-term needs. So I think there's a lot of room to experiment, but it's definitely challenging.
For that. Bob, turning to you now, thinking about challenges, before we get to your actual proposal, could you speak first about kind of within the existing system, what are some of the barriers, policy barriers, to expanding workers' access to equity through their employers?
Well, I'm not really in that business.
Okay.
I'm here to tell you about a plan, and I think it behooves all of us to try to think about what is the problem we're trying to solve. Why are we sitting around talking about this or that kind of equity mechanism? The problem I think we should focus on, and Annalisa referred to it, is the tremendous wealth gap in this country, which is undermining what I believe are the tenets of American capitalism. And the data is compelling. Most people know there's a wealth gap, but they don't really know the magnitude of it. The top 10% of households by wealth owns 88% of all the stock. The bottom 50% owns less than 1%. American workers wouldn't know a share of stock if they fell over it. And if you're really going to change the wealth distribution in this country in some off-budget kind of a way, because we're not going to be able to get there by new grant programs that transfer wealth, you've got to do it through stock. And that's what I'd like to talk about. That's what we should be, I think, thinking about, as well as the other things on this panel.
Bob, thank you. And we're going to circle back to you in just a second and give you an opportunity to share your legislative fix. First, I just want to return to Annalisa for a minute and give you an opportunity to share a little bit more about Ownership Works, which many know has taken a particular approach to incorporating broad-based equity into your private equity strategy. What do you want to share a little bit, just kind of like about what your philosophy and strategy really is there?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll give you a little bit of context for how I came to this work. So I started my career in employee ownership at Project Equity, and very much focused on business succession as an opportunity to insert employee ownership into business structures. And thinking about businesses changing hands and knowing that private equity is buying and selling businesses all day, every day, it felt like an important place to have a conversation around access to equity participation, particularly because private equity investors commonly share equity participation with senior management, but very uncommonly share it with the rest of the workforce. And so our founder is a co-head of global private equity at KKR, had been doing this in KKR's portfolio and the industrials portfolio for about a decade, including all employees in the equity participation plan, and having really tremendous impacts on the personal financial wellness of the employees at those companies, but also the performance of the company as well. Decided to launch this nonprofit to try to help other investors replicate these outcomes, to create momentum for more workers to get access to this opportunity. We as a nonprofit, we work with investors and companies. We help them size and structure the plan. We help them build a culture of ownership, which is the most complex part of the work. A lot of our efforts there involve convening companies who have put these programs in place so they can learn from and inspire each other. It's one thing for us to say, have owners meetings, do training, share financials, share updates on the value, delegate decision making, do employee engagements. Like, we can tell them all of these things tactically to do to build an ownership culture. It resonates in an entirely different way when they hear a CEO talk about his or her journey to building an ownership culture, the steps that they took, and the outcomes that they've achieved. So improvements in employee engagement, improvements in employee turnover, improvements in safety, and all of which can impact the bottom line of the company. That resonates in a totally different way. So we spend a lot of our energy bringing together executives so they can learn from each other on this ownership culture journey. And then finally, we support companies with implementing financial wellness programs beyond the equity participation program. So this could be something, 5 years down the line in the private equity context. It could be much further down the line in the context of a family-owned business. So what about the short-term financial needs of employees, and how can a company address those? So that's how we work. And the focus on private equity right now, it's a really efficient scale lever. There's 90 companies that have implemented programs already, reaching 110,000 employees. And we're starting to hear from really large family-owned businesses of tens of thousands of employees and public companies. So this idea of getting the flywheel spinning a little bit, I think, is starting to work and creating a runway to expand beyond private equity more broadly.
Thank you so much for that. Barbara and Anthony, I'm curious about examples you have of some of the more kind of inclusive, broad-based models or companies you could point to, or examples you could point to that do a good job of extending equity to a large percentage of the workforce, including in the publicly traded stock market companies. So, Barb, maybe you first.
Sure. I have three companies that I would like to highlight. So the first company that I want to highlight is T-Mobile. T-Mobile shares both discretionary equity awards in the form of RSUs, and they have an employee stock purchase plan. The employee stock purchase plan is obviously open to all T-Mobile employees, but they also grant RSUs to all of their employees. And the reason why I want to highlight T-Mobile is because they have done a really great job at being thoughtful about how they educate employees about what their RSUs are. And frequently an obstacle or a concern that I hear to granting broad-based equity is that lower-ranking employees can't understand it. They don't value it. They won't understand it. I just, in preparation for this, I reached out to some of our members and I got that same feedback. They don't value it. But the fact is, they can understand it and they can value it. T-Mobile does. They actually brought in their ad company, the same company that does the T-Mobile ads that you see on TV. They brought that in to help them figure out how to really grab their employees' attention and educate them about their equity awards. They have a sort of multifaceted program that includes videos, even their emails. Every email they send, they are very, very thoughtful about how that email is worded, down to what subject line is going to get people to open the email. And the fact is, T-Mobile employees do absolutely value those awards. They have an annual grant date every year. It's a big deal. It's a celebration. In the weeks leading up, they're like, grant date's coming. People are like really anticipating their grants. On grant date, everybody wants to see how many shares did they get. And T-Mobile employees are required to accept those RSUs. They have something like an 80% acceptance rate within 2 weeks. That's a phenomenal rate that any public company, even ones who aren't granting down to their lower-ranking employees, would love to have in terms of their RSUs. So that's one example. Another example I want to highlight is SAP. SAP offers an employee stock purchase plan. And they've done some really innovative things. And one obstacle that I think to companies offering equity broadly is that, as I said before, one of the ways that companies most often offer equity to their general workforce is through an employee stock purchase plan. The tax code that governs ESPPs was created in 1964 and has really not been updated. If you go back and you read the code that was adopted in 1964, which I did just yesterday just to make sure, it's pretty much the same as the tax code that we are working with today, down to the dollar limit on how much stock employees can acquire. That limit has never been adjusted since 1964 for inflation. And one problem with that tax code is it is very limiting around what companies can do. So SAP's ESPP is a non-qualified plan. They could not do what they wanted to under the structure of U.S. law, so they implemented a plan that is not qualified, and there's two really innovative things that they were able to do because of that. One is they offer a match instead of a discount. And in terms of getting employees to participate in a plan, a match is economically the same thing as a discount. But to go out to employees and be able to say, hey, for every $100 you invest, we're going to give you this number of dollars. It's so much easier to communicate that benefit, especially to people who maybe have never owned stock before in their lives, than to say, hey, we're going to let you buy the stock, but you're going to buy it at a discount. And discount, that's kind of like having a coupon. You're going to pay less. Like, nobody understands that. They don't understand what a discount is. But if you say, we're going to give you, in SAP's case, it's a 40% match. We're going to give you $40 for every $100 you put in this plan. Come on, who wouldn't take that deal? And so that's one thing that they do that they could not do under the U.S. tax code if they had a qualified plan. First of all, the match is greater than the discount that's allowed. But even if they wanted to stick with the standard discount, you can't do it in the form of match under the tax code. The other thing they do that I think is really innovative is they provide a subsidy to everyone except their executives. So that the executives don't get the subsidy, but all other employees get a 20 euro. They're a German company, so all other employees get a 20 euro subsidy, which doesn't sound like that much. That's like a $20 somewhere a little over $20 in the U.S. right now. But for some employees in some countries, that $20 subsidy is the difference between them being able to buy a single share of stock and them not being able to participate in the plan because they can't contribute enough to buy a share of stock because the contributions are based on how much they can contribute through their pay. So SAP, I think, they really took a step back and really thought outside the box when they put that plan in place and really came up with a great benefit. But a lot of companies aren't willing to do that. What we see, the majority of equity of ESPPs that we see in the United States are tax qualified plans. And you can't provide those sorts of benefits under a tax qualified plan. Am I out of time, or can I do one more?
One quickie.
Okay, one quickie. The other one, this is a tax qualified plan. It's Outset Medical. Outset Medical makes a dialysis machine that people can use in their homes. And they're in the biotech space, but they do have a lot of frontline workers who are just installing these machines in people's homes. They took a different approach. They wanted an ESPP that would be really inclusive, but they wanted one to be tax qualified, so they stuck within the guidelines of what you're allowed to do in the U.S. But the most innovative, so it's a very generous ESPP, I'll state that. It's the most generous that you can offer in the U.S. and still be tax qualified. But they also have a very innovative financing method where employees, instead of having to contribute through payroll, are able to finance their purchases by selling some of the shares that they're purchasing. And that really eliminates a huge obstacle to participating in the ESPP, which is that employees have to contribute through payroll deductions. Outset Medical has achieved an over 90% participation rate on their ESPP. And remember, I think I said earlier, maybe not, median participation rates for ESPPs right now is around 38%. So a 90% participation rate is phenomenal. Yep. It really speaks to the kind of benefit, what that kind of benefit can do in terms of getting equity to employees.
Thank you, Barb.
I'll be quick. I do want to seize on one thing you just mentioned, which I agree with. The concept that the frontline employees won't appreciate, understand, or value this. I fundamentally disagree with that. And I would say, and Ownership Works has done a fantastic job of this, is really illustrating like what this can mean for your average employee. And I think at a headline level, and with all due respect to, I think you said T-Mobile, like I don't think your small business needs to figure out the perfect way to craft an email. And I'm not disparaging, I just mean like that's a huge resource. But you can communicate the headline value to a lot of folks. I think then the nuance and then meeting them where they are can be complicated. And candidly, Carta has spent a huge amount of time just on the venture-backed space of explaining what equity options and how to value them look like, what tax looks like, how to think about this for your own scenario. And that's where there's a lot of nuance. But I think companies that are committed to this can build the structures in the right way, and they do need to be absolutely thoughtful about it. And there are so many structures. So really explaining what are you indexing for, how do you think about this, then how do we put the right structure in place, and then being able to meet employees wherever they are in the stack, where they are, to help explain what this is going to mean for them on a nuanced and operational perspective. That is challenging. I don't dispute it. But I think that the friction point of my frontline workers won't appreciate or understand this, I think is a cop-out that we shouldn't accept. And I bring this up, and I know you're asking for specific companies. I don't want to necessarily delve into specific companies, but this is the tide that has allowed us to really understand broad-based employee ownership works for businesses and segments that I wouldn't have thought it would work for. There are opportunities, of course, in tech and growth, but we're seeing this being adopted by increasingly financial and professional services firms, which sounds like an obvious next concentric circle. But increasingly, we're also seeing hospitality groups adopt these types of metrics, where, again, if you had asked me a year ago would I thought that would be a rich field for this, I'd have said maybe in time, but not right away. But I think when you can connect what this means for the workforce, not only does it get at the wealth gap, but it gets at the performance opportunity for the business and gets the buy-in from those gatekeepers.
Really helpful. Thank you so much. So in preparation for Bob here, and Bob, let me just say you've named the wealth gap a couple times, and I think that issue that you've pinpointed so precisely really is a motivator for many of us up on this stage and many of us in this room, and certainly for the Rutgers Institute, kind of a principal driver for our commitment to advance understanding and conduct research on these questions. So I do just want to share that at the Rutgers Institute, we are planning in the coming year to launch kind of a major new focus on and policy analysis of how to expand broad-based equity compensation. So in a way, this is kind of like a little bit of a kickoff or the first kind of step for us. And we'll be having an academic conference in California in partnership with Carta and many other groups, and continuing that work this year, collecting a number of different ideas and analyzing them. And Bob, I understand that you have have carefully crafted a legislative proposal, and Bob asked me if he could have an extra couple of minutes. So I'm going to allow him up to 5 minutes to share this, because we want to be sure to have time for Q&A, and we wrap up at 2:15. So I'm going to invite you now to share your vision for sort of a legislative fix on this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And don't hesitate to give me the elbow.
Okay, I won't.
So what I'm about to talk about...
Up.
I'm sorry. What I'm about to... Am I on? What I'm about to talk about is in no way undercutting what you've heard from my three colleagues. They're operating within the constraints of current law and trying to figure out the best ways to advance employee ownership within those constraints. Maybe because I'm older, I'm impatient, and I'm looking for, with your help, a really aggressive opportunity to change the game. And, again, nothing negative about what everybody's trying to do to operate within current law, but it's not changing the game. 50% of households still only own less than 1% of stock, despite all of the miracles that my colleagues have done. So what's the plan? It's pretty simple. This piece of legislation, which will be shortly reintroduced, I hope, with bipartisan sponsorship, will permit all publicly traded companies in the U.S. and private companies with 500 and more employees to voluntarily elect to receive a 3 percentage point reduction in their corporate income tax rate, so under current law from 21% to 18%, provided they put in place what's called a share plan. And a share plan, very simply, means that they have to grant 5% of their stock, their current float, their market value, 5% of their stock, to the lowest 80% compensated of their employees over not more than 5 years. Very simple. You want a tax reduction? Share your stock. Now, we've done a number of models economically on this. It looks like that the 3-point federal tax reduction, which is about $65 billion a year, would subsidize 50 to 70% of the cost to the company shareholders of these grants. Now, recognize that when you grant stock, you're diluting current shareholders. You're not hurting the company. You're diluting the current shareholders. Well, the current shareholders, by definition, are rich. 1% of people owns over 50% of all stock. So through the private sector, you can engineer what amounts to a kind of Robin Hood plan at the lowest possible cost that I can think of to the federal government. So for $665 billion over 10 years, you can effect a $2.5 trillion wealth transfer to 60 million people, which is about half of the private sector workforce. You know, if I were able to pull all the strings, Annalisa, what I would also say was all of those private equity companies like the one I'm involved with and the ones you're working with who are taking over the world, there are now 11,000 private equity funded companies. I would say, guess what, PE firms, you want to keep your carried interest deduction? You got to have a share plan. Use the law to achieve an expansion of employee ownership and transfer of wealth. I don't like to talk about employee ownership per se because it's fine if people sell the stock after it's vested. And I should have said there's an element, a 5-year vesting period in the share plans. So it's not ongoing ownership. It's wealth creation. So that's the plan. I need your help very much, not just in advocacy, but in fine-tuning already from Barb. I've learned some things that I darn well better address in this bill. So I genuinely need help. I'm a kind of a one-man band here, which is ridiculous. So that's the idea, and I hope you like it.
Bob, thank you. Wonderful. Well, friends, I think we should turn it over to audience Q&A. We've heard some really profound reflections from everyone. Bob put a big visionary legislative proposal on the table. Would love to invite some questions from the audience, directed to the whole group or directed to one individual. Yes, in the back? Yeah.
So how do you guys think about maintaining the employee ownership piece in the flip?
Yeah, that's such an important piece. So there's typically 3 ways that a private equity firm will exit. They'll sell to another private equity firm. The company might go public, or it could be sold to an existing company and be part of a strategic acquisition. So we've seen examples of a private equity firm that's a partner of Ownership Works, selling a company to another private equity firm and negotiating as part of that sale a commitment to relaunch the program. So one of the exits this summer that happened, and the new investor is relaunching the program, which is very exciting. And that's the kind of thing we're hoping to encourage among the firms that work with Ownership Works and beyond. We also have examples of companies that have gone public and continue or launch a program in conjunction with an IPO. So we think that's a really viable strategy. Most of the 90 companies all of the 90 companies that we're working with are very early in the journey. So there aren't many exits as yet, but so we're hoping to be able to encourage that. If it's a strategic acquisition, it's really hard. If that company doesn't have broad-based ownership.
Questions? See Daniel. Daniel, please.
This question might be for you, Annalisa, but maybe the others as well. So last month I was at a private equity forum down in Orlando with Regina also, and I was really disheartened because I had to completely flip what I was thinking. KKR, BlackRock, Goldman were all greatly in support of ownership or wealth going to owners. It was the pension funds who couldn't have cared less. And they were saying, we just care about return to our shareholders. And so here are these pension funds that are looking out for the pensions, the wealth of people, and they couldn't have cared less. And I was like, what is going on? Can you just share what's your education outreach to get, obviously the employees get it, as you've been saying, but the people that are buying your clients, they're not getting it.
So that's really interesting. We have a limited partner leadership council, and there are a handful of pension funds that are on it. So Washington State Investment Board, CalPERS, New York Common, New York City Comptroller's Office, State of Michigan. They are very supportive. They see this as a win-win, not in any way dilutive. But there are pension funds that have had a strong reaction. We make the case that these programs pay for themselves, that they improve the performance of the company. It's not dilutive, and we have case studies that indicate that. But pension funds are operating in a highly politicized environment right now. There are some that see this as an ESG initiative, and they're in states where that is not, where the legislature is not supportive, and that impacts how their willingness to engage around this. So that's what I've observed.
I would just add, similar, like none of these segments are monolith. And that's why it's so important that we make the case of value versus virtue, because most pension funds, no matter if they're in like a politicized environment or not, have an obligation to their individual contributors, whether it's firefighters, teachers, whatever it is, and they take that fiduciary responsibility very seriously. And so whether you think about this through the ESG lens or not, and we tend not to, I think in all cases, you've got to be able to make the case that this is going to improve those returns to get that capital supportive of this. And to Bob's point, like I would love to see policy changes, but to me, we might be able to do some nudges around it, and who knows, that broad-based approach might work. But like in reality, it's setting industry forward and bringing the capital providers and these gatekeepers on board, and that's through virtue or value, not necessarily virtue.
And even for publicly held companies, any publicly held company that wants to offer equity to its employees, that plan has to be approved by shareholders. And the pension funds and the other institutional investors are often an obstacle to getting these plans approved by shareholders. Now, most institutional investors will approve an ESPP because they see it as broad-based, and there's a cap on how many shares they'll approve, but it's a pretty generous cap. It's usually 10% of the company's common stock outstanding. So ESPPs you can usually get passed, but the awards where the programs where companies might want to offer discretionary equity awards, those a company is not going to go to shareholders for the most part without a plan that they are sure is going to pass. So that means they are building into their design the restrictions that shareholders are imposing on those plans, and that absolutely affects their ability to offer equity to their general workforce, because then they can't get enough shares sometimes to do it. Not all companies, some private, for some public companies, they don't have a large institutional investment base, and it's not an issue. But where there are pension plans and other institutional investors, it's a concern.
Well, maybe we need some legislation, Barb, that says that certain plans don't have to go to shareholders for approval.
I have a clarification question for Barbara about one of your statistics. I think you said 58% of publicly traded companies in the survey offered stock to the full workforce or to all tiers. Does that 58% include like ESPPs, whether or not the individual employee opts in? So I know there's about 30% of employees who have access to an ESPP will actually sign up. So that 58%.
Yes. So yes, the 58%,
eligibility.
They're offering some form of
offering,
equity
but they're
to
not
their
necessarily
employees.
okay.
Most of the time, it's in the form of an ESPP, which means that a lot of their employees may not be taking advantage of the equity that they are being offered, because an ESPP requires the employee to actively sign up to participate.
No, thank you. Okay.
And because there are innovations like what SAP has done to encourage employees to sign up, but some of those innovations you can't do under the tax code with a qualified plan. So I think ESPPs are great. Don't get me wrong. I love an ESPP. I benefited from participating in an ESPP. But in terms of an equity vehicle delivery, equity delivery vehicle for the broad base of employees, it is a little bit problematic because you have to get employees to sign up versus other types of equity awards, or even what Bob has proposed, which would be employees would get it. They wouldn't have to sign up and pay, find a way to pay for it.
Yeah. No, thank you. So I think when we sort of crack open this nut of kind of the equity comp conversation, I think while often people think about equity compensation just as executive compensation, because it's so common for a company to choose to extend stock compensation just to the senior management or just to the software engineers, et cetera. But as we could hear from all of these stories, there's more flexibility within the system. Individual companies can choose to make their equity comp plans much more inclusive than they often are. Cap table companies can kind of promote and facilitate that sort of more broad-based model. Ownership Works is innovating in such really important ways. And it may in the end be the case that we require a policy fix. So this has been a wonderful kind of first crack at this whole topic. And I really thank the panel, thank the questions, audience for your questions. And I think we'll next have a break. Matt, do you have some instructions, some marching orders? Thank you.